Whispered love between bars. The first time Officer Maya Reeves looked into Lena Carver's eyes through the reinforced glass of cell block D, she felt something crack open inside her chest, something she had spent 31 years carefully sealing shut. It was not attraction she recognized immediately. It was recognition, the kind that happens when you see someone carrying the same invisible weight you have been dragging behind you your entire life, the weight of a person who has been misunderstood so completely and for so long that they have begun to misunderstand themselves. Maya had been a corrections officer at Whitmore, women's correctional facility, for 6 years. She was known for her steadiness, her fairness, and the quiet authority she carried, without cruelty, a rare combination, in a system built on control. She wore her uniform like armor, kept her personal life locked behind the same thick walls she patrolled every morning before dawn, and she had never once allowed herself to become emotionally entangled with any of the women in her care. She knew the rules. She had written them into her own bones. And then Lena Carver arrived on a Tuesday in October, escorted in with her wrists bound and her chin lifted, and Maya's carefully constructed world began its slow, irreversible unraveling. Lena had been convicted of fraud, a white-collar crime born from desperation after her younger sister's hospital. Bills had swallowed everything their family had. She had forged documents, redirected funds, and when it all unraveled, she had refused to implicate anyone else who had helped her. She took the full sentence, 4 years. The women in her block called her honest, which in prison was the highest compliment anyone could receive. She was 34, lean with dark circles under her eyes and a mouth that seemed to be constantly holding back something enormous, like grief or defiance or both. Maya noticed her the way you notice a fire from across a dark field, not because Lena demanded attention, but because she existed with such quiet, contained intensity that the air around her seemed to vibrate differently. Lena spent her free hours reading, philosophy mostly, and poetry, and she wrote letters that she never sent, folding them into small squares and tucking them beneath her mattress. Maya only knew this because she had conducted a routine cell check one afternoon and found a letter that had slipped to the floor, and without meaning to, her eyes caught a single line before she placed it face down on the bed. The line read, "I am still capable of loving something, and that terrifies me." Maya said nothing. She completed the check. She walked out of the cell and stood in the corridor, with her back against the cold wall for a moment longer. Then she needed to, breathing. Their first real conversation happened 3 weeks later, entirely by accident. Maya was pulling a late shift during a facility lockdown following a disturbance in another wing, and she found Lena sitting awake on her bunk at 2 in the morning, pressing her palms flat against her thighs as if trying to keep herself grounded. Maya paused at the cell door and asked, simply and quietly, whether she was all right. Lena looked up at her with those dark, exhausted eyes and said she was fine, and Maya did not believe her, and something in the way she did not move away communicated that clearly. So Lena told the truth instead. She said she was not fine. She said she was afraid of becoming someone unrecognizable to herself. She said that the worst part of incarceration was not the loss of freedom but the loss of the version of yourself that existed before. Everything went wrong. Maya listened. She did not offer platitudes or deflect with policy. She stood at that door for 40 minutes and she listened the way no one had listened to Lena in years. When Maya finally walked away down the corridor, she pressed her hand briefly against the cold metal of the cell door as she passed. Not a gesture anyone would have seen, not a gesture that violated any rule, but a gesture that said, "I heard you. You are real. You matter." That was when things began to change between them. Not dramatically, not with sudden declarations or stolen moments of reckless abandon. It happened the way water changes the shape of stone. Slowly, invisibly, and with a force that only becomes visible once the transformation is already complete. Maya began to look forward to her rounds in a way that unsettled her deeply. She began to think about Lena's words during her drive home, turning them over in her mind like smooth river rocks. She began to acknowledge, in the most private corridors of her own heart, that what she felt was not simply compassion. It was something more complex, and more dangerous, and more alive than compassion had ever felt before. For Maya, her identity had always been something she carried quietly. She had come out to herself at 22, and to almost no one else since. The culture of her profession demanded a kind of emotional armoring that made vulnerability feel professionally fatal, and she had internalized that so deeply that she had spent years in a romantic silence so complete it had started to feel like a personality rather than a wound. She had not allowed herself to want anyone in so long that she had nearly forgotten the feeling entirely. Lena's presence was waking something up inside her, and Maya was frightened of it the way you are frightened of a light being turned on in a room. You have lived in the dark for so long. She knew, with absolute clarity, that she could never act on what she felt. Lena was in her care. The power imbalance was enormous and undeniable. The ethics of her profession, the law, the very real possibility of destroying both of their lives, these were not small obstacles. These were walls. And Maya was not someone who broke down walls for herself. She had never believed herself to be worth that kind of destruction. But love, the quiet, whispering, devastating kind, does not ask permission before it enters. It does not check the rulebook. It simply arrives and rearranges everything without asking whether you were ready. What grew between them in those months was not a romance in the conventional sense. It was something rarer and stranger and more human than that. It was a profound mutual witnessing. Lena began to leave books on her bunk with certain passages underlined, and Maya began to read them during her lunch breaks with a intensity that surprised even herself. They developed a language without words, a nod through the corridor that carried entire sentences, a pause at a door that communicated more than most people's hours of conversation. The other women in Cell Block D noticed, in the way incarcerated women always notice everything, but what they saw was not inappropriate. What they saw was an officer who treated one of their own like she was still fully human, and that was something none of them took for granted. The crisis came in Lena's second year. She received news that her younger sister, the one she had committed her crime to protect, had relapsed into illness and that the prognosis was uncertain. Lena shut down completely. She stopped reading. She stopped eating properly. She sat on her bunk during free hours and stared at the wall with the hollow, 1,000-yard stillness of someone who has decided that hope is a cruelty they can no longer afford. The facility counselor saw her twice and marked her as stable. Maya saw her every day and knew she was not. One evening, near the end of Maya's shift, she stopped outside Lena's cell and spoke her name very softly. When Lena looked up, Maya slid a single folded piece of paper through the narrow gap in the door. She walked away before Lena could respond. The paper contained a poem, not one Maya had written, but one she had carried in her wallet for 11 years since reading it in a hospital waiting room the night her own mother had been in surgery. It was about endurance, about the strange courage of continuing to exist when existence feels like punishment, about the small, stubborn insistence of love even in impossible places. Lena read it that night, and the next morning when Maya walked her rounds, Lena was sitting up. She was eating. She had a book open in her lap. She did not look at Maya when she passed, but she placed 2 fingers briefly against the wall of her cell at exactly the moment. Maya walked by, a gesture so small that no camera would capture it, so quiet that no rulebook had a name for it, but so full of meaning that Maya felt it travel through the wall and into her chest, like a hand pressed against her heart. If you believe in the kind of love that refuses to be diminished by walls, or rules or impossible circumstances, the kind that exists in the space between 2 people who truly see each other, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that they are worthy of being seen. The months that followed were a study in restraint and dignity. Maya never overstepped. She never allowed the feeling to become something that would harm Lena or compromise her safety, but she carried what existed between them with a tenderness that quietly transformed her. She applied for a reassignment to an advocacy-focused unit within the facility. She began attending workshops on rehabilitation and reintegration. She started writing to legislators about sentencing reform, using language that was precise and passionate in equal measure. She could not free Lena, she could not hold her hand or tell her plainly what she felt, but she could fight for a world in which women like Lena were treated as whole human beings rather than consequences. Lena was released 14 months early, due to good behavior and a legislative reform that reduced Sentences for nonviolent financial crimes. On the morning of her release, Maya was not on duty. She had arranged it that way deliberately, because she knew that if she watched Lena walk through those doors, she might do something as simple and catastrophic as smile too widely, and she did not trust herself with that. 3 months after Lena's release, Maya found a letter in her facility mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten, and it began, "I am writing this because you once told me, without saying a word, that I was still worth something. I want you to know that I believed you. I want you to know that because of that belief, I am still here, still fighting, still becoming. I don't know if what existed between us had a name. I think perhaps some of the most important things don't, but I know that you saved my life. In the only way one person can truly save another, by refusing to look away." Maya sat in her car in the facility parking lot for a long time after reading that letter. She did not cry. She simply sat with it the way you sit with something enormous and true, letting it take up all the space it deserved. Then she folded the letter carefully, placed it in her wallet behind the poem she had carried for 11 years, and went back inside to do her job. A little more broken than before, and a great deal more whole. If this story moved something inside you, if it reminded you that love in its truest form is about witness and dignity and the refusal to let another person disappear, please drop a comment below, telling us what this story meant to you. Your words reach more people than you know. Some loves are never named. Some loves exist entirely in the space between what is felt and what is said, in the fold of a letter, in 2 fingers pressed against a cold wall, in the quiet, radical act of seeing someone so completely that they begin to see themselves again. Maya and Lena never had what the world would call a love story. But between those bars and those whispered moments of genuine human connection, they had something the world rarely offers and almost never deserves: the truth of each other. And that, in the end, was everything.